webinar about logic apps. My name is Tom Pantazzi. Relatively new with Pragmatic Works, and in this webinar we'll be discussing how to use logic apps for notifications from Azure Data Factory. Here's a basic agenda of what we'll be following. First, we'll discuss what logic apps is, and then we'll talk about the things it can do, and then we'll move on to a demo in the logic designer, where we'll do things like connect Azure Data Factory to logic apps. We'll access various SQL objects, in this case stored procs, in two different ways, one with output parameters and a return code, and another where we're calling on a stored proc that gives us a result set that we'll iterate through. Then we'll show how to use conditional logic. In conditional logic in a logic app, you evaluate the previous steps outputs, the previous steps, and then we'll show loop processing for processing through the result set, that we get through from that stored proc. And I'll also show some exception handling. And if we have enough time, I'll show you how to use a tool from Microsoft called Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer. It's something I bumped into while building the logic app. It's a handy tool for managing blob storage on Azure. Not necessarily involved in logic apps, but it's definitely a nice tool. What is logic apps? Well, it's a cloud service from Microsoft that is designed for, I think of it kind of like PowerShell, or Flow, but with an ability to link various things together. So you can use it for operational tasks, business processes. If this happens, we have to send this information to this department, that kind of thing, or workflows. An order has to go through these steps, and we make sure it goes through all the steps. Another thing that is nice with apps is because it's in the cloud, it can interact with cloud applications, but it can also interact with traditional applications. So if you have an on-prem system that you need to talk to, it has ability to do that as well. The kind of data it can work with is it can work with normal SQL data, relational modeling, that kind of thing, data warehouse data, and unstructured data, so blob files, flat files, all kinds of stuff. And the nice thing is it works with disparate systems. So it doesn't the systems don't even really have to know that they're talking to another system. For example, in this case, we're going to be talking with Outlook.com to send an email, and it doesn't care that we came from Azure Data Factory. We could have come from anywhere, and it allows you to do that connection. So, to send an email, obviously you need to have an address to send it to. Well, and structure your email. It knows how to structure email, and Azure Data Factory knows how to pass the information in. So it's kind of nice to have that functionality and the ability to glue together. Another thing that is really nice is the design layout for logic apps is really handy for designing and prototyping. But it doesn't just stop there, because it allows you to deliver the kind of robustness you need in an actual application, not a prototype. So you're not prototyping something you're going to throw away. As you prototype it, you might have to rethink some things after the prototype's done. But typically, you can take that prototype, make it fit within an environment, which is actually what we did in this case. This is a real example of something we built to service a customer, and a number of people saw it and thought they'd like to see a webinar on it, so we decided to do a webinar. And then the other nice thing is you don't have to stand up any infrastructure. The infrastructure is there. If you need infrastructure because your prototype might require it, for example, you might need an on-prem server that you need to talk to, well, then of course you're going to have to stand that up. But what the least amount of work it's going to take to get done is whatever's minimal for your environment. So the infrastructure pretty much could exist already. In our case, it did. We already had the Azure Data Factory built, so the storage blobs were there, all the other stuff were there. I even had an email account, so I didn't have to set up an email account for Outlook. So a lot of times you're not going to have to do a lot to get at Logic App to work. And then the other nice thing is once they're done, just like most Azure stuff. It's extremely scalable and it's very cost efficient because you only pay for what you need when you need it. So if you determine you need more at a certain time, you can ramp it up. You can even change your plan and get more efficiency out of it. And we'll talk about some performance and efficiency in a little bit. What are some of the things you can do with a Logic app? What are some of the applications? Well, obviously the first one here is adding notification capabilities into an Azure solution. We wanted to be able to send out an email saying that a long-running job was done and what was the status of that job. This is a perfect example of that. Processing data from disparate systems or interfaces, that's another thing that is really good at. We have another Logic app we're using for moving flat files around. And it's really good for that because it's taking it from one legacy system, pulling it into the cloud, massaging it, and then sending it off to an API, a REST API. Another thing for Logic apps is that cloud, your Azure cloud management. You have things in your cloud and you might need to move them around or delete them after they're done. That's another thing we have a Logic app for, that as a pipeline gets done, well, the files that we've moved around and bounced from one place to another, we don't need all the copies, so we go back and clean up the copies once we're done. Another thing that it's very good at is interfacing with file systems, FTP, SFTP, or even a file share. If you have a file share on an integration runtime machine or data gateway, you can access that file share and do metadata operations or look at files, move files, that kind of thing. And this is something that I haven't done, but a trainer here at Pragmatic Works came up with the idea to do this. He set up a Logic app to monitor Twitter and look for certain words, and then based on certain words, go off and do something. But also, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by too many entries. You could set something up like that, like say you were looking for a Christmas gift. You're going to see a lot of Christmas gifts, right? You don't want to see that in Twitter and then have to process the millions of entries or thousands of entries that might come in. So one of the things he came up with was a way to put a limit on that. So yeah, I want to see what the general trend is, but I don't want to have to pay to see all the data. So he stopped processing after a certain period of time. And that was what the Logic app was really good at, was able to have the intelligence built in to do the things that might not be intuitive in a normal stream processing. Okay, so I didn't call this who's it for, but it kind of is. Who is this for? I'm living proof that you don't need to know a lot about Logic apps or Azure for that matter to accomplish pretty cool stuff with it. Though I've got 40 years in the computer industry, 35 of it doing database work, 20 years of data warehouse work. None of that really came into play once I started working with Azure, except for the knowledge, obviously. There's knowledge there and there's understanding of data that I'm not going to belittle. But I really didn't need all of that to get moving with Azure, or for that matter, to say I took this pipeline I built and now, well, I need notification. Let's jump into the Logic apps. And a few minutes later, well, maybe a few days later, I was able to get things rolling. So it's not that complex and it's pretty straightforward. So if you haven't done anything, my suggestion is give it a try, experiment, and you'll learn. The design of our email system that we built, or email app that we built, is, as I've said, it's for use from Azure Data Factory. We have HTML with some CSS in it that we're using for making sure that the email looks proper, and we built some template files. We have 2 template files we use, and we've pushed them to Blob Storage. Now that's stuff you'd have to do outside of this world. They're already there and already set up. I'm not going to show you how to move data around in Blob Storage. I'm not going to teach that in this class. I'm also not going to show you how to set up an Azure SQL server. We already have a SQL server set up. I'm not going to go through that. But one of the things that I am going to do is I'm going to show you the differences between the kind of calls you can make just on a stored proc. There's tons of SQL calls you can make, but even within a stored proc, depending upon whether the stored proc has output parameters or not, you have to deal with it differently depending upon whether it has a result set that it gives back. You deal with it differently. And then finally, after the logic app is done processing, it's going to have looked for, did any errors occur in the data in the pipeline? And if they did, then we're going to set a high importance flag. So that's a conditional operation we're also going to have inside this little app. Assumptions that are that you have some of these things, and these are some of the connections I'm also going to show you how to interact with. I'm not going to show you again how to set up any of this stuff. Azure Data Factory, I'm going to show you how you link the logic app to Azure Data Factory. I'll show you how you link to the Blob Storage to read the template files, and how to call a store procedure and how to connect to a SQL server. And I'll even show you how you connect to your Outlook account. But all of that, we'll assume that's beyond the scope of this webinar. Otherwise, we wouldn't get anything done. And I've included in the slides here, and I'll show a demo of Azure Storage Explorer. It's a really handy tool. It's a desktop application that lets you have what's something like a Windows Explorer view of Azure Blob Storage. And so you can move around and look at what's out there and manipulate storage, manipulate files, and that kind of thing. Okay, on to the demo. Let's see. So this is the completed app, but I'm going to show you what it looks like when we start out. I unplugged my network cable and it has to refresh. So when you want to start a logic app, you want to go ahead and create one, and we've got one set up here, but I'm also going to do a new one, and I'll show you how you do just getting started with a new app. So there are a couple of ways. You can go and create a resource, and when you go to create a resource, it's not showing up necessarily here, but if you start searching, which is the way typically I would do if I was looking, you could find it here, logic app, and then say create. But since I've done a fair amount of them, I keep it in my favorites over here. So you can click over here, and then that brings up the logic apps layout. And here you can go ahead and click add. And when you add, now it'll start. Now, one of the things that I will caution you, I haven't found a way to rename them. You may be able to, but I haven't been able to. So choose your name carefully. One of the standards we use here at Pragmatic Works is LA stands for logic app. So when you call this logic app from somewhere else, you'll know you're calling a logic app. So I'm going to call this, just to show you how to create logic app, email app. And it'll want you to either create a resource group or choose an existing one. I've got one already, so I'll put it in that group, and that already has a location, so it'll default to that location. And then you click create. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is twofold. One, it takes a little while. It says it's done, but you'll notice that there'll be nothing in the list that says that that's here. It's missing. Because if you notice over to the right there, it says it's still deploying. And while it's deploying, it doesn't show up here. When the deployment is complete in a few seconds, then it still won't show up, but you can refresh and you'll get to see it. So now it says it's there. You could either click on it to go to resource, or you can refresh here, and now you'll see here's your app. So when you go to your app, it just brings up a basic overview of what you could do with logic apps. You could walk through the video to see it, or you can pick one of the common triggers. Logic apps have something that gets them started. That's a trigger. And you can pick any one of these when a message is received in a service bus. In our case, we will be using when an HTTP request is received. You could just say, I want to start with a blank logic app as well, and that'll just open up a blank designer. But this is where we would have gone. And when you first start a logic app and you're trying to use this HTTP request received, it's a little tricky, because if you notice right now it says the URL will be generated after save. Well, what does that mean? there's no URL here because we haven't saved this. When you save it, they'll create a unique URL that will stay with this app, and you can then pass this to other things. In our case, it'll be a web call out of a data factory, and that URL will now know how to pass in. Another thing that you will get, so I'm going to go ahead and just save this real quick so that it does put it. Now you can see there it is, and you can copy that, and that would be something you would paste. You'll notice otherwise it's a pretty blank slate here. I'm not going to go through a full creation. I'm going to show you how it's created because there's some things that are a little tricky, and we wouldn't be able to do that in an hour. So I'm going to jump back over to the actual logic app we have. One thing I want to point out too is, you'll notice that when you're in the designer, this scroll bar on the bottom lets you go back and forth. If you find yourself looking at your screen and you're saying, why is it doing this? Why can't I see this whole screen? It's because of the scroll bar. You don't have to X this out to get it to show up. You can just scroll over. You could X it out, but you don't have to. This is how the HTTP request is structured now. The only difference here is we set up a JSON that we're going to populate from our web call in Azure Data Factory, and we're going to pass in some values. We're going to pass in a value for who we're going to send the email to, what's the data factory name we're calling from, and there's a pipeline audit ID that we have, and that's what tells us what happened on the pipeline. We're going to pass that value in so that they can be used downstream. If you want to add a new action, you just click add a new action. We need to get that data from the templates that I mentioned earlier, and I'll show you those templates real quick so you get an idea what they look like. Let's see. Here's one of them. This is the email header. So it's basically just creating the header of an HTML document, but it's got this little CSS section so that we can have left align, center align, and right align that we'll use in the table that we build in the email that has the results. And it basically has this little, verbiage, and then a little header that says the Azure Data Factory completed below are the results, and then it'll add the results. The other thing that will come in is a second template that we'll read, and that's the email table template, which will structure an HTML table to hold the column data that we'll pull out of that proc. But before we can do anything, we need to read these two files. They happen to exist in Blob, and when you want to add a new action, you click here. You can either add a parallel branch or add an action. In this case, to add an action, this would be a Blob Storage action, and you'll notice it remembers the recent things you do up here. If you can't find what you're looking for, you're not sure what it is, you can search and it'll start to find things. So if I said blob up here, it would start showing me what I can do with blobs. And the nice thing is now it shows me that here are some things I could do. I could either click here to get all the actions available with Azure Blob Storage's control, or I could come down and say, oh, look, get blob content. That's what I want to do. So I can click on that, and once I've clicked on that, it'll ask me to specify the blob. That's how you add an action. I'm not going to put that in right here because I've already got it here, but I do want to show you that when you start out, one of the first things you want to do is rename, because as you can see right now, I can't rename this. Because once a step is used further down, it's referenced further down. And so if I change the name of this, then the objects below wouldn't know how to access it. Now, I assume Microsoft could fix this and say, okay, if you rename it down south, but it doesn't do that. There are some ways, and if we have some time at the end, I can show you how you can overcome this. But my caution is always rename as soon as you create a step. Make the step say what it's going to be. There is a caveat. The first step you can't rename. This does not have rename as an option. It never did. It's not because something came after it. It just won't let you rename it. Not sure why they chose that, but I guess they assume that that's the start. You could have multiple get blobs like we do. We have one that's get blob email header and one that's getting get blob table header. And basically all that's doing is saying, to connect to the blob, I'll show you how you do that. So here's how you see your storage. It already knows what storage connections you have. But if you wanted to add a new one, you scroll down so you can see a little bit better. These are the blob storage accounts I have set up for this particular user. So if I double click on this, it selects the text, which is kind of funky. Again, this is a control I think Microsoft could do better. But if you drag it up in here, now it puts the name there for you so you don't have to type it. And then you can create that connection. I'm not going to do that because I've already got it connected. But that's all you have to do is you pick the name you want, put it in there, and then when you have to pick the file you want. So in this case, you can click the file folder, and you'll notice there's a folder called Blob Container. And by the way, Azure Storage has blob containers, then folders can exist inside of them. If a folder ever gets empty, all the files go away, the folder will be deleted. So you be careful about using folders in blob storage. And the container is not a folder. It looks like it is, but you'll notice it has to be it is all lowercase because it has to be. You can't use mixed case. You can't use special characters. It has to just be lowercase letters. But in my template files folder, you can see here's that template file that we referenced. And sure enough, it shows up in here. You could have just typed that in here as well if you chose. So the next step is we're going to go get that email table header, which has the table structure. Next thing we need to do is we need to set up some variables because, for one, there are some variables that we need to pass into the stored proc, and there's some things we have to do for them. But also, by setting up a variable, you guarantee its scope, it will be visible, throughout. Something might change later on, and you can't get to that scope any further, and so a variable lets you hold a value while you're waiting. So we have a variable for send to, and the way we do this, again, you're going to go and add an action, and in this case, it's called a variable, right? So you're going to go to variable, and you'll notice there aren't a lot of things you can do to variables. The first thing you have to do with any variable is you have to initialize it before you can set it. You might think, oh, I'll just go set a variable. No, if it's not initialized, it won't be set. You can initialize while set it. You can set it while you're initializing. You can set a default value for it. But if it's not initialized, it will give you an error if you try to. And that's because it puts it in the dropdown. You can't even try to get to its name. It won't show up. In this case, I'm showing how you initialize the subject. I got ahead of myself. I'm sorry. In this case, I'm going to put in the send to email that we passed from the HTTP request. And you can kind of tell it because you notice here it's green and this is green. The color coding helps you see where it was. But another thing I want to point out over here, and I'm sorry for the alerts popping up. When you come into something that you can populate with dynamic content, unlike in Azure where you have to do Alt-P to open it up, it comes up right here. And there are two tabs over here. It's not necessarily obvious that there are two tabs. You can search for content on either side. In this case, this is data or variables or values that can come from previous steps. So in this case, I could put in here the results of the two get contents or any one of the values that came out of the HTTP request that match this. One of them was an integer, so it's not going to be able to be a string value. This knows it has to be a string value because I said it's a string, so it won't let me put an integer here unless I convert it. If I wanted to, I could click to see more, and then this pipeline audit ID, which is an integer, could be pushed over there, but before I do that, I had better convert it. That would be something I would do in an expression. The expressions are similar to what you would see in SQL expressions or in DAX. And as you can tell, you see they'll give you an example. Another nice thing is here when you search, so let's say I had wanted to concatenate something. I could start searching for, oh, look, coalesce. I like that command. Maybe that's the one I want, but concatenate's the one I want. So I can select concatenate, and it'll let me, it shows me what I'm supposed to fill in, and then I can start to fill it in. Now, one of the things you'll want to do when you do that, and let me come back over here. You can't type concat while you're in dynamic content. You have to go over to an expression to pull up a function. So once you come into the expression and start creating the function, now that'll work. If I had tried to type concat while I was over in the other side, it would think I'm searching for something. See, because here it's a search. So I start typing concat, and it says there's nothing that matches that. Matter of fact, I get some things that match con, but you can't. So if you needed to use a function, you have to first start by pulling the function in, either clicking on it or pulling it in. Another thing to bear in mind is there's not only one string function. I'm sure you could imagine that. So whenever you wonder, click See More, and See More will show you all of the things that are under that category, whatever category that is, whether it's an expression or even in dynamic content. So that's one of the things you can do. In this case, all we did was I clicked on the send mail and it popped in there. It's in there again, take it out. That's how you can pull in your dynamic content. So that will become the to email that we're going to send to. Now we have a new kind of variable we're creating. The next few variables are going to be parameters we're going to pass into our stored proc. Now, one of the problems with a stored proc is this stored proc is passing about output parameters. And I'll scroll down real quick to show you the call to the stored proc. And you can see I set up a call to a stored proc and it gave me all the parameters. I need to fill them in. Well, I happen to know that the purple ones are output parameters and the green one is my input parameter. Well, if you're familiar with SQL, you'll know that an output parameter in SQL that's a varchar has to have length, but you don't have any place to put length in here. So it just picks a length, and I'm not sure how it does it, but it's not good because it will truncate data if it's longer than that. So what you need to do is if you're going to use a value, you'll notice that this has some spaces in here. To be accurate, it's 255 spaces because I know that the pipeline name can be 255 bytes long. So I populated this with 255 bytes to ensure that the output parameter is long enough to take any value that it's going to get. That's the only way I could figure out how to get this to work. The next one, I didn't have to do that because once I've set the master pipeline to 255 bytes, I don't have to keep trying to copy this string in here, which is really kind of hard to see. I can just say use master pipeline. And this way, if it turns out, oh, wait, we needed it to be 512, I can push this one out to 512, and all the rest will get 512. So I'm using that to initialize the next 4 variables because they all are output variables from that proc. These 2 are not. These are error codes that will be used later on in another variable, but I initialized them up here. Now we come to the first stored proc that we're going to call. And the first stored proc we're going to call is a proc that's going out and it's going to look at a set of audit tables that process that have the results of a process that ran. So as the Azure Data Factory's dynamic pipeline is running, it's reading data and processing. And if it has a success, it writes it. If it has a failure, it writes it. It writes how long it took for things to occur. And so we're going to read first the parent row that says this pipeline ran, and did it run successfully or unsuccessfully, and how long did it take, pretty much. Then later on, we're going to get the details of what happened in the pipeline. To connect to a SQL object, again, just as we had set up the connection when we were looking at the blob storage, you can click on Change Connection. If you didn't have one, it'll prompt you for a connection, which is basically would look like this. You'll get a screen that shows up that shows any connections you might have had. And in this case, it'll show that you have these connections, and now you can say, well, which one of these databases are you looking for? That was the connection to the SQL server. And now, oh, I want this one. And again, if I double click it, like I showed you earlier, you can drag it up there and then it'll go in. I'm going to cancel this because I don't want to go through the credentials and get that all set up. I don't even remember them. They're so complex. But that's how you connect. And once you do, then you can pick. You'll notice there are several. These are all of the stored procedures in that database. So I could have picked any one of them, and if I pick them, it'll populate them with the appropriate parameters that fit that stored procedure. Filling in these values, again, is pretty straightforward and easy. And as you can see, clicked over here, automatically dynamic content popped up. By the way, another thing I want to just mention that might be handy to some of you. If you do a lot of logic app work, I would recommend that if you have the ability to turn your monitor, because that'll allow it to go longer vertically. Azure Data Factory, as you know, goes horizontally, but logic apps go vertically, and it gets really hard to see. You can pretty much only see about one step at a time this way, but when you flip your screen, it's a lot easier to see. I've got a monitor arm on my desk, and I just flip my monitor when I'm doing logic apps. That's just a little freebie. But as you can see here, we can see our variables, and this is where it really kind of helps, because you can see it's got a scroll window, and if we had everything, and the more you do, as each step builds, this dynamic content window is going to keep growing because there's more things you could have wanted to include. Right now we're seeing the variables we've set up and the two blob contents we got, as well as the HTTP request. So from the HTTP request, you can see we're getting the pipeline audit ID and the rest are variables. And this color coding, just so we're clear, the color coding is for the kind of thing it is, not necessarily. If you had two different variables as we do, they're still purple, but it groups them by color. It just kind of helps make it a little bit more visual. When we got all of that set up, then what we have to do is, after we've called this pipeline or this stored proc to get these pipeline details, one of the things we want to know is, did we get good results back? So I make sure, and I'll show you my proc that's getting called. Let's see here. Yeah. This is the proc that we're calling. And basically we're passing in this integer value, which is an audit ID, and here's our setup for our output. And as you can see, we have two things that are varchar 255. Even though we make status 255, it's only 64, so it's not a problem. Same thing with duration, it's only 10. Why are these strings? Because Logic App works better with strings, and once they're done, all this is just going to do is display. I'm not doing any math on this, so I didn't need to pass them in as numbers or as codes or anything. But basically, it's just going to go out and do some testing. But the thing I wanted to point out here is, you'll notice this doesn't return a result set. The select statement, in fact, is selecting into the output variables. So there'll be no results that come out of this, but we are returning a return code. I think it's a good practice to do that. I don't think it's a requirement that you do that, but I think it's a good practice, because what that does is, now I can have my condition check say, notice this one's red. Again, this goes matching to the red above us. That also kind of makes it handy. And this one came out of the dynamic content for that. And in here, I'm looking at the return code. And so what I want to do is say, if the return code is equal to 0, that means things were good. So follow through the true. And there's nothing that happens on true. That might be a little confusing, but that just means it's going to fall to the next thing. If it's not 0, in other words, we got an error code, then we need to process the error code. And the way we deal with that is we now set that variable. And by the way, that's why we had to set the variable up here, because you cannot initialize a variable inside a conditional or inside a loop for that matter. It has to already exist. So that's one of the things you need to be careful about. But we're going to just push that return code as the error code, and I'm just creating a dummy message here just so I have a message to send back, but it basically says we had an error with this proc. We don't ever expect an error to occur. It shouldn't error out, but if it does, we want to be able to say what the error message was instead of just an error happened. Then the next thing we do, and I'm not sure if both of these are necessary, but I got it to work this way best, so I'm going to recommend it. It's not hard to do. First, we create a response that will go. This is an HTTP response, and this one is found in under request. It's called response. It's not, if you search for HTTP, you won't find it because under HTTP, you have these operations. And, oh, by the way, another thing I wanted to point out, you notice none of these are what we're doing with HTTP, right? That's because the trigger is what we're doing. So we're doing an HTTP trigger. We're not kicking off an HTTP request. So this is something you do after as an action. They don't suggest triggers because that's the first step. So that's not what we're doing either. But what we're doing is this response. And we're sending back a response code of 800, which is just arbitrary. You can pick whichever you want. Just don't send 200 or 400. Well, I guess you could send a 400 class because that is an error code. But we chose 500 because it's not a server error. It's not a page error. It's something else. And we're sending back a JSON that has the error message and the error code in it so that the upstream process can manipulate that if it needs to. And then we issue a terminate. And terminate is found in the control section. So under control, and I'm not showing it, it was recent. Oh, wait, no, there it is. There's control. Terminate is one of the operations in control. You also have the for each loop here and the condition, which we're falling out of here. So when you terminate, then needless to say, nothing below this is going to happen. If we followed our success path, then we would fall into a thing that does go out and get our results. It takes that same audit ID, but it passes it to a proc that it's slightly different. It says get pipeline audit data results. And that one looks like this. That's basically this proc with this where clause left in. So basically it's doing a select and joining two tables together. It's joining the pipeline audit table to the pipeline data audit table, which is these are each element that happened in a pipeline, each pipeline execution. And then there's also an error table. There can be an error associated with each one of the data audit elements. And if there was, then we want to have that error information as well. So it only has the one parameter, and it's not sending back output parameters. Now, the difference is when we get ready to process it, and I'll show you that as we get further down, it needs to be looped through because now it has a data set. You can't just treat it as something that's going to give you values you're going to populate. Up here, if you notice, when we executed this, all we're really doing is giving it placeholders to stick the results. All the results came into these output parameters. So once it was done, it was done. There was nothing else to do. In this case, because we're looking at a result set, we're going to call it. We're going to do that same condition where we look to see, did we get an error? We're going to do the same kind of processing for the error. But if we didn't get an error, now we're going to start consuming that data. Well, the first thing we have to do is we're sending an email. The email needs a subject. So we're going to create a variable called subject. And this is where we get a little different than what we've done before. You'll notice this looks just like some text with some junk thrown together. And that's basically all it is. We've got the verbiage that it takes to make the subject readable. Azure ADF pipeline ID, and then we stick the pipeline in there. And then the pipeline name goes under here. The trigger that fired it goes in here. The status goes here. And then the duration goes here. And that becomes the subject. So we can populate all of that. Well, you notice these are the output parameters that we got from that first call. We could have done this before we called the result set, yes, but we're basically saying, okay, something happened and we can tell you a subject. Now we're going to initialize the body. Well, the body's a little different because notice for the first time we're looking at that file content that we got. We didn't have to put it into a variable or anything to use it. We could just suck it right in right now. And this will take all of that data that was in that file and put it right here. And just to review, that file was, let's see if I can find it again. No, that's the ODS. I apologize. Okay, that file, the first file looks like this. So right now, if you look at our logic app, it's starting out with that file that has all of this, and we're going to end right here at the end of that div statement. And then we're going to say, put a break in, then we're going to name a pipeline. We're going to say what pipeline it was, had a trigger of, and we're going to put the trigger name in. Again, basically the same stuff we put in the subject. This is just going to be the beginning of the email. And then we're going to, after we've laid out that blurb at the beginning, we're going to put in something that says get file content from the email table header, right? And so that's going to pull in this other content. So now we're going to close, start another division, and we're going to build out the rest of this table, or the beginning of this table, right? And this should not be here. This is not part of it. I don't know how that got in there. I must have been typing. But as you can see, it's basically laying out a table with a row, and then a header, a header, a header, a header, and we'll go through and process the rest of this. And then we're going to initialize a variable that we're going to use later on. This is the variable that we're going to set to true if we find an error anywhere. And this is how we'll set the high importance. Initialize it here, and this one's not a string, it's a Boolean, and we're going to initialize it to false because we don't expect an error, but if we find one, we want to do something about it. So here comes the for each. And again, this is another one that comes out of the controls. And with the for each, you'll notice there's only one thing I can put in here. We called two stored procs, but only one returned a result set. And it knows that. It can see when it looks at the proc that it doesn't return or it does return a result set. And if it does, then it lets you process them. You have to give it something to iterate through in a for each. In this case, it's our result set. So what we're going to do in here, everything inside this for each is what's going to happen for every row that we get back. The first thing we're going to do is, this is different. Up until now, we've done initialize a variable. Now we're going to append to it. So we had that body, that HTML body variable that we built, right? And now we want to append the HTML body table. This is the contents of that table. And I think it looks kind of straightforward if you know anything about HTML tables. Here's a TR that's opening it. And then there's a TD, and it's saying make this class left. If you recall that CSS we did, this will make this first column left aligned. And then the next one comes along and says, okay, put in this next thing. And this one happens to be the status, and we're centering it. The first one was the name, and we're putting that left justified, but the status we're going to center. And then the next column's again left, and this is, it shouldn't say error date time. I'm not sure why that says end date time. So I'm going to change that, and I'll show you how easy it is to change it. So I just deleted it, and we did some late changes to this last week, and I had to redo it. That's the error date time, but what we really had wanted was the end date time. There it is, end date time. And then the next one will be the copy duration time. And so this will now populate our little table as it's looping through. You can see this is the first step in a loop. The next step is a condition. And this condition is saying, if the results set, you notice it says here, if the results set error message, and by the way, that's how it looks in the code. It says items for each because it knows you're in the for each loop, and the elements of the for each are the values that the result set are going to return back. This result set returns back a column called error message. If it's null, then that's the happy path. If it's not null, that means we got an error message and we need to do something about that. So what we're going to do when we get an error message is we're going to add another row to that table immediately behind that other row. And that row is going to have first something called a class called error code, which is another CSX designator. And what that's going to do is it's going to highlight in red the error code. And then the next piece is the actual data set name, which is the file name, and the message. They're stuck together with a little dash. I don't know if you can see the dash. And this has a class of error message, which wraps it, and also we have a col span of 3. So it says push this across the 3 columns. And this will make sense. Matter of fact, why don't I show you what this looks like now? This is what a clean email would look like. It has the subject, as you can see, and then a little bit of header information. This is what we built first. And then this is the table this step is building. And then this one, let's see if I can find this one here. I tried to make sure I had 2 out there, but I'm going to have to go back to my Outlook and find that one. Okay, here's an error condition one. So this shows how the error conditions show up. And as you can see, it can get verbose. So we have it wrapping that around, and it's taking up all 3 of these columns. So this is the layout for that error condition. And as you can see, it's sucking in the CSX as we wanted. And the nice thing about that template structure is if you don't like the look, you change your template and upload it, and you don't have to do any coding. You don't have to do any work. It's just there. And then the other thing we need to do at this step, because we did find an error, something went wrong in this pipeline, we now want to say error found is equal to true. And so this will iterate through this loop. We'll go back, and now you can see the loop got bigger. As you open up the elements in the loop, you'll see it makes it look bigger. But this is what's going through it. Now there's one more thing before we leave the for each that I want to show you, and that is under settings. Now, some of these things you find by you click a little advanced or something like I've shown you before, where we've done change connection, and some might have advanced on them and whatnot. I believe the get blob had advanced. Show advanced options. Sometimes they stick it there, sometimes they stick it here, but other times they have it under settings. And in the case of a for loop, there's a special setting you want to look at. And I'll go to that real quick and show you that setting. That setting is Concurrency Control. And right now I've got it set off because I want to show you how it works. You actually, in my case, for this thing, it has to be on, because if it's not, those emails won't go in order. I'm not sure if you remember when we were looking at the results set, it has an order by clause. It's ordering it by a certain order, and we need that. It's ordering it by the pipeline ID and then the data source name. So we get the file. It comes out in basically file name order, and we want it to be that way. However, if you just turn on concurrency control, that won't do it for you. Turning it off won't do it for you either. You need to turn it on, and then you need to turn it down to 1. Because if you don't turn it on, you're saying be as concurrent as you want to be. And it'll just do arbitrary concurrency, which it will probably have resources to do. If you tell it you need concurrency, then it will reserve the amount of concurrency or parallel processes you decide. Or you can say, I don't want it, by setting it to 1. I know it's a negative and it doesn't make sense, but that's how you get it to turn off parallel processing. And that's kind of important when you consider this email would look funny if this file, well, actually it does look funny because the job it's running under, this shows the problem. Um, I'm working on a team and probably somebody had to make some changes and forgot to turn that back on. But you can see this is the effect of not having concurrency on. The file name is CF user fields, and you can see that one's up here. And it's yet, this line should be directly under that, and it's not. This one worked properly, but as you can see, concurrency will just happen as it's going. As it gets a chance to stick it in there, it's going to. If you had concurrency set to 1, then it would definitely get it in the appropriate order. So this is I'm glad that actually happened so I can show you the problem. That's what that solves. And you'll see that in other areas too, where you have a chance to turn on parallelism or not. I tend to turn it on while debugging for certain, and that's more because then you know the order things are processing in. If you don't need it, then by all means you don't have to have it on, and I wouldn't recommend it because it'll go faster if you don't. But if order or significance matters, then you need to come in here. So I'm going to close that out. And then, so now we're done. If we've processed through all the result sets, then we should have a nearly complete email. The last piece we have to do is append the footer to the TML body. I forgot the H. Yeah. Fortunately, this one can still be renamed because it's not used underneath, and I could do so, but I'm not going to here. But basically, this is just closing out that HTML tag so that we have a clean HTML to push to the email. And now for the reason we started this, we wanted to send an email. I know it seems like a long way to go to get there, but this is where we are. When we get ready to send an email, again, to set up your connection, what you'll do is you'll say add new connection, and this one's different than the others. It's going to take you and try to connect you to Outlook or to Outlook.com and see, do you have an account? And if you have an account, it's going to click to your account. So yeah, I have an account, and I'm signed in, so I'm going to say, yeah, I want that account. That's basically what you're going to do at that point. Once you've done that, it now knows how you can send email. That's all it really is. So you do need a Microsoft account that you can use. Once you've done that, that's all the work necessary. Now, in the body, needless to say, we did all this work to build this variable called the body, so we're just sticking that body in here. The subject, same thing. We pre-built it. It's ready to go. Dump it in here, and our send to goes in here. All done, right? Wait a second. No, look, send to, it's not there. You don't see it, do you? I didn't need it. I don't know why. For whatever reason, it's not showing up here. This, by the way, is why I created the variable, because I wasn't seeing it even showing up as anything I could select. And I was thinking, why not? So I said, well, I'll just go create a variable. And as you can see, the variable doesn't show up, and I don't know why that is either. But this is another example of show more. Now I can see the variable, so I could pick it. And I know nothing has happened to it, so it's safe. If I had scrolled down a little bit further, I could have clicked see more over here and seen that it was here, and I could have used it. But I didn't when I created the variable. So there's an example of a mistake I made. But that's that. That's how you get that in there. And that's, again, an example of see more, see less. I do want to show you some advanced options on here. You can obviously include attachments to it if you desire. You can put a BCC or a CC on it. But this is where we're setting that importance. And the thing I want to show you here is, first of all, you'll notice this is a function, right? So we went over to the expression, and I said I wanted to do if, and I actually literally did it like this. I said if. Oh, okay, there's if, and let me do if. So we're going to start with if, and I'm going to say, what's my expression? And I did have to fool around with the expression a few times, and that's why I chose to set a variable that was a Boolean, because it's going to be the kind of expression I want. First, I was trying to do an expression that did, was there a string in the error message? And that became a bit of a challenge, because at the time I didn't realize there's a function that they'd use for equals. You can't just use the equals clause. If you need to check equality, you need to use the function for equals. But in this case, I have a Boolean, so I can now go back to my dynamic content and get that variable that we've populated, and I'm going to look for error found. Where is it? And again, this is why having a horizontal or vertical monitor makes it easier. Let's see, what is it? It's called error found. Oh, here we are. No, no, it's in there, and I'm not sure why it's not. Let's see. What did I call it up here? If you wonder what it is, you can come back and make sure you call it. Yeah, it's called error found, and I don't know why it's not showing up. I had done it already, and it's oh, there it is. This is at the top. Okay, sorry. So error found, and then when it's true, I want to say, and let me get rid of this. I don't know why this shows up all the time, but it goes away if you just click in here. They're suggesting things. If you know email, this is a literal. So if it's true, you want to set this to high, and then if it's false, you want to set it to normal. That's basically what's going on in this little if clause. So I'm not going to do it again because I've already got it in there, but that's how I set the importance. You could have done a similar thing with the HTML. I will, before we go on, I'm going to show you a couple of other options for sending email, but that's how this email works. And then finally, we close out with a response that says we were successful. I don't need to terminate here because there's nothing left to do. It'll naturally terminate. But that's basically how you use a Logic App Designer. The one thing I haven't shown you, and I will show you real quick, is how to connect it to a data factory, what it looks like when it's connected to a data factory. So let me pull that over here. Okay. This is a data factory we have running, and it goes and gets some metadata, does some lookup, does some processing, then does a for each loop to get all the files. And when it's done, it's going to call a web email. This is just a web operation under general. Web looks over here. If you've done any Azure Data Factory, that's what it looks like. When you come over here, under the settings, this is where that URL that wasn't there until we saved it gets pasted. It's of type post, and so we pick post. And here's where I put in that JSON. This is where the magic kind of comes in. And basically, this JSON, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit better. There we go. Oh, that was too much. Reset. Sorry about that. This JSON basically has the parameters that we were looking for. It's getting a pipeline name from the pipeline. The audit ID is being manually set because I knew that one had errors and 65 doesn't. And then it has my email address, and you can put whatever email address you want in. In our environment, actually, it's coming from a file, but this shows you how you build it. It's just basic JSON. That's all it takes to call that operation. I don't have post-processing set up on this because we're not doing it in here. This is just a demo of the Logic app, but you could then post-process that and look at the results that came back. So does anybody have any questions? Let's go back to our presentation here. There we go. Some things to remember. You want to rename your actions as soon as you create them because it's not easy to rename them afterwards. Let me show that real quick, actually, because there is something you can do. If you notice here, one of the things that is handy is there's a thing called Code View. If you click on Code View, this is all of the code it takes to make that operation occur. And if, for example, I wanted to change something, I could find where it's represented in here. So, for example, let me find an action for you. Okay, let's see. This one, append to HTML body table. Remember we created that action? This is what it's called. And by the way, the spaces get replaced with underscores. If I wanted to rename this, I could copy this entire text, do a select all, copy it, bring it to a text editor, find all the occurrences of append to HTML body table spelled exactly like this, change their name, and then I could use that. That would be a way of renaming and solving that problem if you need to. My recommendation is don't find yourself needing to, and that won't be a problem. How much more time do I have? Well, I guess I'm out of time, but I'm gonna finish up, and if you have questions, you can send questions to my email, which is in the beginning and at the end. Tom at tpantazzi at Pragmatic Works. But I also want to make sure we go through these things to remember. If you don't see something in a dynamic value, remember, click see more. It might be hidden. You can use variables to guarantee you'll get scope throughout the process. Make sure you check out your parallel processing. That is something I do want to show you one thing real quick in the data factory. Here's another place where you do have parallel processing, right? So on the get metadata object, that's one of them, right? That's something that can run in sequence or, well, no, maybe that's not it. Oh, it's the for each. I'm sorry, it is the for each. The for each can run sequentially. If you're doing for each operations in Azure Data Factory, you might want to set that to sequential as well, at least for testing, so you can see that the appropriate next step occurs. You don't have to worry about that in Logic App as much, but that's the same kind of concept. And then there's Azure Data Explorer. And I want to show you that real quick because I think that that's really valuable to see. This is Azure Data Factory Explorer, and you can get it from that link. As you can see, I have a storage account set up, so I can go to my storage account. I can pull up the blob containers. Here are the blob containers I have. And in this blob container, I have this folder called template files, and I can do what I want with it. If I go here, I'll see that this is template files. I can double click on the template files. Now, like I said it earlier, if a folder is empty, it goes away. It won't have empty folders. You'll notice there's no create a folder here. If I want to create a folder, I have to upload a file to it. That's how you create a folder. So be careful of folders. But this is a nice tool for manipulating files. If you need to upload, you can upload a folder or an individual file, and they'll dump them up here for you. You can delete them. You can, do what you need. If you need to download them back again, you can do that as well. I recommend checking out this tool. Other than that, I think we're at the end. Any questions? Looking at the chat, I don't see any questions in the chat.
We got a few questions in here, Tom. If you see, can you see
I do.
the questions? Yeah, just a few of them in here.
Oh, they're in questions. Duh. I didn't see. I saw chat. Sorry, folks. I cannot read them.
If you push the little arrow, the square with the little arrow coming out of it, you can kind of expand the screen, or I can read them for you if you want.
Oh, yeah, I see that. There you go. That's much better. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Someone asked if I was sharing the code to test it myself. No, it's been well tested. I did change a lot of it last night because I didn't want to expose some stuff. But no, it's well tested. It's working. How do you build security? I don't know how to. The security is implied by the security of the objects you're connected to, I think. You have to have the security to get to the blob storage. You have to have the security to get to the SQL server. Likewise, you have to have the security to use the Outlook. So Azure is marshaling that security under the covers. It's nothing more than that. How do you address different environments for logic apps? I have to admit that's something we're working on, where our DevOps setup is a bit frazzled right now, and I can't answer that. I will, if you email me, I will let you know what we come out with when we get that resolved. That's next week's work. Sorry. How do I address different? What's the last one here? Yes, it does look very much like Flow. I would agree with that. SSIS, how often? No, the email address does not need to exist. You could have put in a bad email address, absolutely. Yeah, I used a real one because I wanted to see what the email looked like, but that would have been a good idea for this demo so that people wouldn't see the email I was using. But I want you to have my email address. So there we go. What's the difference between this and Flow? Well, Flow works independently and it's its own thing. I have a Flow that I set up because I'm late for a meeting, so it looks at my calendar and texts my phone 2 minutes before a meeting, so I remember to log into my meeting because most of my meetings are Skype. But I might be busy and forget, so I have it 2 minutes before, get me started on my meeting. But that works independently. It doesn't connect to anything. It's just Flow. Flow works by itself. This is like Flow in Azure. So it lets you connect Flow to Azure objects. That's basically, I think, the difference, at least my understanding of it. Oh, yes, the new Pragmatic Works course. I was working with Mitchell while he was doing this. As a matter of fact, three of us, Joe Abbott, who's a logic app genius, came in, gave us a review of what he has been doing with it, and he's been doing some really amazing stuff. And so then Mitchell decided to do a whole course on it. It originally was one module in his ADF course, and he decided to do a whole course. And yes, I highly recommend checking out that course. Mitchell's probably one of our best instructors, but then they're all great. But that one, he was really excited about. That's where he goes through showing you how to do that Twitter thing. I forget what word he was searching for, but he wanted to illustrate how to do that kind of thing. So if you're interested in that at all, I highly recommend taking that class. Matter of fact, I'm going to take it. Even though I know how to do this stuff, I want to see how he did. I think that's it for the questions. So I'll close it from there. Did we record this? I think we recorded this. So if you need it, you can contact Pragmatic and it'll probably be posted. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And yes, we do record this, everybody. As usual, you should receive an email link tomorrow, and it should be up on our site by the end of the day. So just look out for that. And if you have any questions, like Tom said, please feel free to reach out to him or myself. And thank you guys for joining the webinar. And Tom, thank you so much for hosting. We appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye-bye.